Welcome, Soda Alliance family and allies to the strategy session, part 7, in collaboration with our Whole Child Policy Table. We invite you, thank you for those who are just joining us for the first time today. We invite you to please be more than a viewer today. Actually, let's start now. Let's see who's in the room. If you could please just join us in the chat function and just state your name and where you're joining us from today. See folks from Louisville, friends from California, Tulsa, DC, Boston area. Welcome, welcome. See friends from Chicago joining us today. From here on, please do also use the chat for comments, those sidebars, those snaps, those amens, those plus ones, and most importantly, questions for our panelists. I want to quickly get to our speakers today, since I know they have important information to share. But because we're being joined by some new friends, I'd like to take a brief moment to ground us in why we're here today. It's no secret that we continue to live in unprecedented times. The policy choices that we make, particularly in this pivotal moment in our country, can either ignore or further exacerbate inequity, or it can be leveraged to create more equitable, identity-affirming, whole child safe environments where all young people, particularly our BIPOC youth, can learn and thrive. The question is, what choices are leaders making? Leaders from the Soda Alliance, we came together across our fields of research, practice, and policy because we believe that knowledge from the science of learning and development can drive transformative change in education and youth serving systems. Today's strategy session, in collaboration with the Whole Child Policy Table, is focused on the choices that states are making as they work to advance whole child equity efforts. We are joined today by some amazing leaders. Megan Blanco from the National Association of State Boards of Education, Jen Tapali from the Learning Policy Institute, Catherine Van Ness from the National Governors Association, and Autumn Rivera from the National Conference of State Legislators. Before we get to our speakers, I want to turn it to Jen, who's going to share a little bit more about the Whole Child Policy Table. Jen? Jen, I believe you're on mute.
Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to share my screen here. I don't, Sam, if you can let me do that. But in the meantime, I will just say thank you to Sam and the Sold Alliance for having us. We're excited to share on the work of the Whole Child Policy Table and discuss the experiences of states in this unique moment. To give a little bit of an overview of the Whole Child Policy Table, it consists of approximately 12 members, or 12 member organizations, including some of the ones that you see represented by my fellow panelists. So we have the National Association of State Boards of Education, the National Conference of State Legislatures, the National Governors Association, the Conference of State School Officers, along with some of our research and policy folks. We've got, oh, thank you, I'm gonna share now. There we go. So I don't have to actually say all these names, you can actually see it. Oh, let me go back a slide. So you can see some of the organizations that are involved. So like I said, CASEL's also one of our partners, Education Commission of States, Ed Council and the Sold Alliance, the After School Alliance and Forum for Youth Investment, and several others. So the goals of the whole child policy table, we actually started this work right after the Seed Commission sunsetted in 2019. So we've been going strong since spring of 2019. The goals that we've had are, one, to establish the partnerships with those organizations and with others that I didn't mention to make sure we're creating coherence and alignment in the field, developing a shared whole child policy agenda specifically for states. But we're now also going to be working on a federal policy agenda, and I'll talk a little bit about how that translates down to the school and district level. Working directly with state policymakers to advance that whole child policy agenda. And moving forward, we're looking to expand and deepen those whole child policy state efforts by identifying states primed for deeper whole child work and supporting state collaboratives, a lot of which we did in the first phase of our work. And one of the things that we'll be working on, and I know many states that you all said you were from are going to be working with us around trying to put whole child practice into teacher licensure standards, which is a really great lever, we think, for making sure that teachers are well prepared to go out and to implement whole child practices and structures in classrooms. Part of our agenda will be coming out through what we're calling the Whole Child Policy Toolkit. The toolkit will feature research and the evidence base for the whole child practices, state policy strategies and actions, state examples of how different states have actually been doing this work already, a resource library that we think will be really helpful for policymakers, and other guidance and tools. And it's all around these 5 settings, which, if you're familiar with the Seed Commission report, this is drawn from that work. So helping states think about setting a whole child vision, transforming learning settings, redesigning curriculum, instruction, assessment, and accountability systems, building adult capacity and expertise, and aligning resources equitably and efficiently. Some of you may be familiar with this. I know that the design principles for schools have been a topic of previous SOLD strategy sessions, but the whole child policy toolkit is aligned with the recently released SOLD design principles playbook, which clearly define what equitable whole child design aligned with the science of learning and development looks like. So developed by the Learning Policy Institute and Turnaround for Children in association with the SOLD Alliance, the design principles fall into these 5 categories that I won't go into, but these are all the different categories we see as being instrumental to whole child design. And while the SOLD design principles that are laid out in this playbook are intended to help educators adopt the structures and practices that can support whole child design for schools and classrooms, the whole child policy toolkit we're developing and that will be out later this year will provide guidance and tools for state policymakers to create the enabling policy conditions for schools and districts to be able to instantiate the design principles. We know there are a lot of barriers and challenges that come with doing this work at the school and classroom level, and we want to help state policymakers think about ways that they can remove those barriers and provide greater opportunities for schools and districts to adopt this work. And finally, to move into a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today, I just wanted to give a brief overview of something you're all aware of, the unprecedented investment by the federal government in education through ARPA and some of the other ones that came before that, the CARES Act, and I'm forgetting the name of the other one, but it was a supplemental grant. But we've seen these transformative investments. The ARPA plan alone the American Rescue Plan Act alone provides hundreds of billions of dollars to the early through higher education continuum, helping communities mitigate the impact of COVID and rebuild in an equitable manner. A few key education highlights of ARPA include $122 billion to support K-12 education, with a focus on learning recovery, providing wraparound supports, and stabilizing and growing a diverse and well-prepared educator workforce. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I am going to invite our panelists to come onto video. And I want to turn the conversation over to them so we can learn a little bit more about what states have been doing with that funding, how they're using it to advance whole child policy, and some of the barriers, challenges, and other things that they're facing. So I'm gonna ask all of you this first question, but I'm gonna ask Megan to respond first. So Megan, in light of COVID and school reopenings, how are each of your how is your constituency, state school board members, attending the whole child and equity needs? And then Autumn and Catherine, you can jump in for your constituencies after.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks to the SOLD Alliance for hosting today's webinar and for inviting NASB to participate. If it's okay with you, I'll tell you a little bit of background for those who are unfamiliar with NASB and our members. The National Association of State Boards of Education is a nonpartisan, nonprofit membership association that serves state boards around the country. And we view whole child policy development in a broad way in that we examine every policy and how it will impact a child's development and opportunity to learn, right? So whether that be housing, access to nutritional food, access to well-qualified teachers, after-school learning opportunities, and so on and so on. So that's how we come to this topic, and we understand that there are different strategies and layers of that conversation, whether it be social emotional learning standards, trauma-informed care and professional development for educators and staff and other school staff. But we look at it very broadly. So, and we know that the SOLD Alliance colleagues do as well. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with state boards, they operate as a lay body over state education systems. They work super closely with their state education agencies to outline and make progress towards achieving a vision of an equitable and excellent public education system that ensures students of all backgrounds and circumstances are prepared to succeed in schoolwork and life. And while their context and governance and policy authority vary slightly by state by state, most state boards do set learning standards, graduation requirements, accountability and assessment programs, accreditation and teacher preparation standards. And as it pertains to today's discussion, they have a role in approving their state ARPA plans and district ARP plans as well. In terms of how they've been approaching issues that have come up throughout the pandemic, it runs the gamut. I remember one of the first calls that we started getting in the beginning of March 2022 was around school meal programming. How were we going to ensure that kiddos still got their meals? And at that time, thinking it was, schools were going to be closed for just a couple of weeks, and here we are, more than a year later, and that's still a challenge for some places, especially that supply pipeline. State boards have also been very concerned with keeping students engaged as they've had to confront virtual only instruction at times, and now in some cases hybrid instruction, and closing that digital equity gap. Also ensuring that we're building relationships between students and staff and whole school communities. That's so central to a student being able to learn and be present and engage in their learning. Of course, making sure that students, staff, parents, families, caregivers have the measures to engage with their school safely. And so those safety protocols and providing the social, emotional, mental, and behavioral health supports to students and staff as they overcome this really challenging year and continue in this sort of challenging environment. So we at NASB and our members think that ART presents a really important outsized opportunity for states to make bold decisions and take actions to reframe and rethink and reflect upon what education can and should be. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into how we are thinking about it as a national organization as well as our members.
Thanks, Megan. That is great. Autumn or Catherine, you want to talk a little bit more about what you're hearing from your members?
Yeah, I can go. So again, yes, thank you guys for having us and providing us the space to have these conversations during these times. And I'll say too, so the National Conference of State Legislatures, or NCSL, is a nonpartisan organization. We work with both legislative staff and legislators in all 50 states and the territories. So it's a little bit about us. So earlier this year, NCSL established the Whole Child Policy Advisory Group to guide the organization and its efforts to support legislators and staff as they formulate education policies, focused on fostering safe and healthy learning environments where all students can achieve academic success. We're currently working with a bipartisan group of 8 legislators and 6 legislative staff members from 12 states. We're trying our best to cover as much of the geographical US as we can. Increasingly, they are concerned about student mental health and the interconnectedness between social emotional learning, academic development, adult capacity, and more. And you're going to hear me, I think, a lot use interconnectedness as a phrase because it's really been a main focus for our members. So, at least for legislators, the pandemic has really highlighted that, especially with social, emotional, and academic development, especially over, I think, maybe the last month or so as schools have been coming back up, because we've seen a shift a little bit from not focusing just on catching up from, learning and also focusing, making sure that students are able to actually get their needs met in schools, getting the social, emotional, and mental health needs like during this recovery time. So it's not that learning recovery hasn't completely moved, but it's definitely shifted focus. And I think there's still stress around, the vaccine not being able for, available for younger kids, and even for the older kids having to have quarantined or school still shutting down. There's still a lot of uncertainty. So it's still stressful for these kids. And I'll share in the chat an article that focuses on some of the student mental health legislation trends we've seen. And some of those include states focusing on mental health and wellness curricula, suicide prevention, staff training and professional development, mental health related absenteeism, and more. So yeah, like I said, most for us has just been that real interconnectedness being a main focus.
I love that. I love the interconnectedness. We'd love to see more of that. Catherine, how about you?
Sure. I'll just again echo our thanks for being included in this conversation and for the work of the SOLD Alliance. In terms of NGA, our members are the bipartisan 55 governors of the states and territories of the United States. We were formed back in 1908, so we've been providing a forum for governors and their staff to get together, share learnings with each other for over 100 years now. And in terms of what we've been seeing with the pandemic and how governors and their staff are thinking about children's holistic needs, back in 2019, early 2020, we were hearing governors talk about these issues in terms of kind of 3 overarching themes. They were really concerned about workforce readiness, employability skills, and in states that did some portrait of a graduate work and other processes to really identify some key skills that they wanted high school graduates to have. There was a lot of overlap with social emotional learning competencies, and states were starting to draw those connections. Another theme was really comprehensive school safety reform. So of course, as states were looking at some of the physical infrastructure to secure school buildings, we were also coming to the understanding that it was important to care for children as their whole person and kind of build that safety from the inside out as well and attend to any mental health needs there. And the third theme was really in providing educational equity and making sure that all students felt safe and welcomed at school and were able to take advantage of their education. And so, there were certainly conversations happening around the holistic needs of students, but the pandemic really brought that into stark relief for every single governor and their offices, really kind of prioritizing that moving through the pandemic. And as we're looking to bring students back to school now, of course, governors have a few key priorities that all really attend to students' holistic needs. So the health and safety concerns that were already mentioned. Governors in particular have done a lot to try to close the digital divide. And so we see that as, an equity issue as well in attending to not just, the learning in past years and now again this year, as there are some of those disruptions that Autumn was alluding to. But making sure that students have the knowledge to really take advantage of those devices and use them, to their full benefit. And then, of course, the accelerated learning. We saw governors really trying to harness this past summer as a chance to not only, catch up with some unfinished learning from the past pandemic years, but also, really rebuild those connections rebuild some of those relationships, especially in states where schools were primarily closed, so that they could go back into the fall with a really strong start for in-person learning. So that's some of what we've seen as kind of the transition from pre to now the pandemic lens on whole child needs.
Thank you. And that's, that's really interesting because I think you guys all talked about holistic needs, whole child needs, the interconnectedness of all these different things that policymakers are, have been aware of. The pandemic exacerbated that awareness in the greatest possible way. And then we have now where we're seeing the school reopenings and what's happening around that. And there's still a lot of, Autumn, like you said, there's still a lot of, upheaval there. There's still a lot of back and forth with things that are happening and, having those health and safety concerns. But I'm curious now as we think about, the funding that is available for states, are you actually seeing the money being spent towards the things that you are saying that your constituents are prioritizing, or are these things I'll back up and say, I know that a lot of conversation early on in the pandemic was around, we need kids back in school, we need to support their social emotional well-being, they can't do that from afar, they need to be in classrooms. And then it seemed like this past summer, there was a lot of movement more towards, there's been so much learning loss. And there was a fear, I think, amongst a lot of people that the social emotional, the mental health needs, the engagement pieces, the relationship pieces might get pushed aside in terms of prioritization coming back, and how this money gets spent that might ultimately go more towards the academic and forget these other pieces. So I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of these trends. And Catherine, I'm gonna start with you. Within those ARPA funds, there are governor set-asides. Where they get to decide where that money goes. And I'm wondering what you're seeing. Are you seeing that those governors are actually putting their money where their mouth is, I guess we'd say, with that set aside?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And as our NGA chairman, Governor Hutchinson from Arkansas likes to say, if you're going to announce an initiative, you need to back it up with funding, because that will be the first question the media asks, the state legislators ask, how serious are you, unless you're really funding it. So, what we are looking at is both the GEAR funds, so the set-asides that governors had, the authority to spend, and then in addition to the ESSER funds, there are many states where the governor and state education chief work very closely. And so, even for the education set-asides, there are certainly shared priorities there with many governors' offices. So I'll give a couple of examples, but I think, we've been very pleased to see that in many states, there really is funding being set aside for these supports, and they run the gamut. There are some states that are looking to support the hiring of staff and, support services. So in North Carolina, there were GEAR funds sent to the state board to help with hiring counselors, social workers, psychologists for schools. And in Rhode Island as well, GEAR funds were set aside to provide counselors in all of their middle and high schools, with a particular focus on behavioral health, which is so important right now as students re-enter school buildings. And then in Arkansas, Governor Hutchinson set aside $15 million of his funds for a statewide strategy for mental and behavioral health supports, and through another NGA project, which I can share some information about in the chat box for folks who are interested. Arkansas is one of 6 states that we're supporting with more intensive technical assistance, and they'll be putting together a cross-agency state strategic plan for addressing student and staff wellness in schools. And so that's something that we were really excited again to see backed up with some funding to support the outcomes of that plan. And there are so many other states, Michigan, Iowa, Louisiana. In Louisiana, they set aside funds for an online SEL curriculum that will be available to all K-12 students. and made sure to prioritize teacher professional learning to really support those efforts. So, from the hiring of staff to providing the curriculum, we saw a focus again on the summer. In Arizona, Governor Ducey set aside money for summer learning and partnerships with Boys and Girls Clubs. Partnering with community-based organizations is something that we're seeing as a really important vehicle to make sure that, wherever those trusting relationships are for families, that we're taking advantage of those existing relationships to engage families and students as they're coming back to school. So I'll leave it there and let other folks jump in.
Thank you. It's great to hear. I especially want to hear more about the work happening in Arkansas, because that sounds, to reiterate what Autumn said, great interconnectedness. And with that, I'm actually going to pass it over to you, Autumn, and ask you a similar question. I know NCSL has been tracking a little bit of where these funds have been spent, but you also have been tracking not just the K-12 space, but also the out of school, after school, summer learning space. So if you could share a little bit more about what you've been seeing there, that would be great.
Of course. Yeah. So like Jen was saying, we track a little bit of everything. And so one of the things is tracking how legislators have been using after school and summer learning as a way to re-engage students both academically and social emotionally. So one way states have supported doing that is by funding grant programs for these. So for example, Maine enacted legislation that establishes something called the Summer Success Pilot Program Fund. It's a little bit of a mouthful and I'm always stumbling over it, but this fund requires the encouragement of facilitation of high quality summer success pilot programs. So these programs have to meet like certain guidelines, including focusing on the achievement gap between high performing and low performing students. Specifically, the programs are to focus on community partnerships by involving and partnering with these community-based organizations so that they can, help to support learning and development. And another way, so in North Carolina, they passed legislation that establishes a school extension learning, recovery, and enrichment programs to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on at-risk students. So it's a way to make sure that they're doing in-person and focusing on specific topics and enrichment for these K through 12 students. Lawmakers have also focused on focusing on whole child efforts by creating expanding learning opportunities councils or task force. So for example, Oklahoma did this by creating the out of school time task force. So this task force is going to review maps of after school programs and highlight gaps in access. So it's a good way for them to be able to evaluate programs to improve and increase the number of quality and affordable out of school times programs. So also talking about the gaps in access. With NCSL since 2014, we've been working with statewide after school networks with support from the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation to offer them to apply to a competitive grant opportunity. The statewide after school networks, for those of you not familiar, refer to the diverse group of organizations and stakeholders that work together to share best practices and advocate for after school and summer learning programs in the state. So the goal of these grants is for statewide networks to collect and compile data around after school and summer learning so that they can share this with policymakers and stakeholders. So similar to kind of what Oklahoma's doing, they can also help to identify gaps in services to inform state investment, federal ESSER dollars going towards these programs. So right now, states are utilizing after school and summer learning not only to help kids catch up and keep up, but also to re-engage them. In some instances, for example, they have been the most consistent relationship for youth during the pandemic, whether that was check-ins in different ways, but not having to physically be in the school buildings when they were shut. And for example, Connecticut is currently partnering with their after school network to ensure all summer program staff have access to professional development on social emotional learning for moving forward. And while they haven't finalized their plans for their 1% from their American Rescue funds, they are convening roundtables that they're including after school partners, families, students, industry experts, and so on. So I'll place some more links in the chat so you guys can get more, but I will let someone else speak now.
And I'll hop in here, Jen, if that's okay, with a couple of things that are very top of mind for state boards and these conversations around using funding wisely are leveraging existing strategic plans, right? Anyone who's gone through a strategic planning process knows it is a lot of work. It can have a lot of payoff in terms of the impact and sort of guiding force to make sure your decisions are thoughtful and intentional. And also around stakeholder engagement. And so I'll say that many state boards are using their existing strategic plans that many of them create in partnership with their state chief, their SEA colleagues, every 5 or 10 years as a means to say, okay, what is our vision for education in the state? What do we want to achieve in the long term? And help use that to help guide their funding decisions and kind of collaborate on what they'll promote or ask for to their colleagues at the state legislature or in the governor's office. And so Nebraska, for instance, earlier or at the end of last year, laid out their legislative priorities for 2021, 2022 that were aligned to their 10-year strategic plan and included components addressing students' social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs. For instance, North Carolina, I know we've all mentioned a couple of times, they joined their chief in releasing a list of budget priorities in February of this year that align with their vision and strategic priorities. Another aspect that I mentioned earlier is around that stakeholder engagement. State boards, that's one of their sweet spots, is really engaging stakeholders, whether it be educators as sitting members or doing roundtables or student voice. More than 20 state boards of education have either a sitting student representative, voting or non-voting member, or student advisory councils that they rely very heavily on to kind of inform them and keep their ear to the ground. And I also just want to acknowledge a lot of work's being done in the policy space that's not necessarily, a funding action, if you will. So I want to highlight Indiana and Wyoming are actively working on their portrait of a graduate. And we all know that that's a critically important work, as you referenced the National Seed Commission's recommendations earlier on. Setting that vision for your state is hugely important to making informed and intentional decisions, right? I also want to acknowledge, Illinois earlier this year adopted new culturally responsive teaching and learning standards. That's something to celebrate for sure. And then we look at Maryland, the Maryland State Board of Education, when examining data, realized, it's been a persistent challenge over the years, just disparities in access and outcomes for youth in their state, and saw that particularly Black boys were having really low sort of outcomes in comparison to other racial peers. And so they focused solely on that through a committee task force and developed out of those conversations, those community collaborations, an educator guide on transforming the culture of Maryland schools for Black boys. So there's a lot of great work still going on as we all also try to make these very pressing spending decisions as well.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. I mean, you made a fantastic point too, and one that I know we all have talked about, and I know the SOLD Alliance has talked about, is thinking about this time as not going back to what was pre-COVID, but thinking about this time as how can we transform, reimagine what education looks like moving forward. And I think one of the big things that states and districts can be thinking about when investing this money and when making policy in general that's impacting schools is thinking about that big picture. What is it that we want to look like? And so I really appreciate that comment, right? Like having a portrait of a graduate, having a vision for your state, and then working towards it can be really useful at this time. And part of that, and I'm going to kind of move to a question that doesn't touch as much on funding before we move a little bit back into some of that. But this is one, I think at the community level, it has definitely, the pandemic has definitely shown, and I know Megan, you said this very early on in your comments about just meeting children's basic needs was like the very first thing. Like, how are we making sure that kids have access to those things that they had in schools? And I know we talk a lot about community school models and making sure kids have access to all of those resources. And I'm wondering, are you guys seeing new opportunities or examples of places that have actually been doing the work of working across state agencies in new and innovative ways? Are you actually seeing examples of states where they have made this decision that it can't just be about the education system, the K-12 system, it has to be bigger? And just thinking about those integrated approaches. So anybody want to jump in with any examples of that I think would be a great learning lesson for all states who want to really think about advancing whole child policy?
I can jump in first on that one. That's definitely a theme that we've been seeing from a lot of the states we're working with in our policy academy. And as it was alluded to earlier as well, a lot of states formed these task forces or advisory councils during the pandemic that did bring together folks from different agencies and different areas that may have previously been siloed, because during a public health emergency that touches on food service delivery and agricultural workers and education and mental health services and childcare that's provided through human services. All of these folks really needed to be talking and coordinating and communicating out to the public in a coordinated way. And so when it came to social emotional learning or student mental health services, we've seen governors and states really leverage those councils or task forces and those relationships that were built, unfortunately, during a time of hardship to really be leveraged for the benefit of schools and students. So in Michigan, Governor Whitmer brought together the Student Recovery Advisory Council, and they put together the blueprint for comprehensive student recovery that also incorporated some great student voice, which is also so important as we're looking to meet students' whole child needs. It's quite radical to ask them what they want to see in their schools, and it shouldn't be. So we were glad to see that happening there. But especially when it comes to the kind of community schools model, Oregon is another state that we're working with, and their health authority has their integrated model for mental health, which is really comprehensive. And now the education folks are taking that and looking at how it can be implemented in the education setting, and are looking at a coordinator person who can help to bring the mental health piece into other services that were already being coordinated at school, because we know that students who receive school-based services are more likely to complete successfully and persist through any treatment. So those are a couple of examples, but the cross-agency work is happening in states across the country, and it is so important as we look to support students' holistic needs. Everyone has a role to play, and so especially governors are good conveners in that sense.
I love that. Everyone does have a role to play, and sometimes we forget that. Autumn or Megan, any comments on that one?
Honestly, Jen, I was starting to pull a resource on student voice and throw it into the chat box. So maybe if Autumn, if you have anything to hop in with.
That's actually funny, because I was also just going to pull something on student voice that I will also be putting in the chat. But so, thanks, Catherine, for really hitting on that, because apparently it struck a chord with both of us. I think, like you're talking about, just like really shedding light on what the science of learning and development is saying, both academic and social development, again, just being interconnected. So I think state leaders are really rethinking education, kind of like what you were saying, Jen, and a lot of its rethinking is moving towards a whole child education. It's forced not only our members, but, across the sector to take a look at like what's gone well and taking the opportunity to change. And these federal dollars have really allowed us to try new things, such as states using these adversarial networks to help manage these programs like I've talked on. So, there's a new way to think about how different could have been partners can now be partners, and how do we build these community partnerships continuing on, and we can just continue to, there's the talk about continuing to scale up moving forward, like you said, not moving backwards, but a lot of conversation about how do we use what bad cards we were dealt to then fix, to then now what do we use with this new hand, So I think there's been a lot of that talking about, working across sectors. But go ahead, Megan, I will let you go.
Yeah, no, and I was going to say, Catherine mentioned this in her remarks around interagency task force. And so just making sure, examining the list of folks who you're inviting to the table. And it's not, the onus shouldn't be on your stakeholders to come seek you out, right? You definitely have to, and I think state leaders are increasingly cognizant of this. You definitely have to go out to the communities and gather their input and build that trust, build that relationship, make them, see that you truly value their perspectives. And something about the U.S. Department of Education's requirements in the state planning process and the law itself requiring that meaningful consultation occur and stakeholder engagement. And so, the Department of Education identified 9 categories of diverse stakeholders that should be engaged, but states are certainly not limited to those 9 categories. And for state boards, I know they're thinking about how, state plans are submitted, but how can we continue those efforts and engaging these stakeholders? So it's this continuous focus on improvement, on hearing what's happening on the ground that's effective, that we need to kind of scale or replicate with tweaks, and maybe what's ineffective, so we can learn from that too, and using that to inform decisions as states consider revising their plans. They have that opportunity to continue revising them through 2024, and so let this be a continuous learning process that we continue to build upon as we learn more.
Yeah, thank you. I just got distracted by the great comment from Grace in the chat too, where she talks about being, the biggest change in making design thinking equitable is the rethinking who gets to be the designer. And Megan, I loved your point too, that, states had a deadline of when to submit their plans. That does not mean that they cannot go back and revise those plans, rethink what they have in those plans. And I think that's really, really important. I know we're getting close to the end of this section, but I wanted to ask one last question before we jump into the Q&A. And that is something that we all have talked about across the policy table before. And something I think a lot of people are concerned about is that, yes, this massive amount of money is going towards schools, which is great, but it has an end point. Schools and districts and states have a deadline of when this money has to be spent by. And there's a lot of concern that when that deadline hits, that what is going to be there to replace that funding? We don't know. It's too far down the line. So I'm wondering if what you're seeing from states or hearing from your members around that concern, but also if you're seeing anything around the way states are thinking to make sure that those dollars are sustainable. So I will pass that off to you. I think it's just something that I know is floating around in the atmosphere. How do we make sure that these dollars don't get thrown into things that then one day just get cut? And Autumn, I see you taking yourself off of mute.
I'm just trying to help the process, I think, overall for legislators, I think they're really interested in just studying what is working, as well as what the challenges are with what is being funded. They're looking for those examples, they're wanting to know what to be doing. And in the coming months, we're looking to spotlight examples of where the funds are being spent effectively to help inform them so that moving forward, they have this information to make these decisions. Because like you said, it's funding they haven't seen before. So what does that look like? What were the decisions made? What got made in other states? And, as I mentioned before, the data grant projects we use are really helpful, not only mapping just programs, but showing concentration of poverty and educational attainment and other indicators of needs to help, inform federal funding. And as states are looking, access to after school and other services as they are thinking about durability past the availability of those funds, So I think a lot of what state legislators are leaning towards is just what's happening, what have we done, what's worked well, what's worked in different contexts, and I think that's the biggest thing for them right now is just using this time right now to learn so that they continue to make the investments that their states, are asking for and need.
I can jump in as well. I think something that we're seeing is a focus on really setting up systems so that, there may be a need for an initial investment to get something off the ground, whether that is related to data collection or communication or access to curriculum, training materials that may be needed, that can then be used on into the future, even if that initial investment does not get renewed. So whether that's setting up systems with family and community engagement, which we're seeing as a really big focus for states and districts that are focused on implementing SEL maybe for the first time, or just wanting families to have more input now that they've been so close to their children's education for so long. These are relationships and communication channels that once they're set up, hopefully that habit is built and can be continued and leaned on into the future, even if there isn't the funding to support a staff person or some other investment over a longer period of time. But it is a good few years, so hopefully it'll be a good start.
Yeah, and I'll say ditto to Catherine's comment around sort of systems and infrastructure improvements around data and interagency collaboration. And I'd say making smart investments, making sure what you're investing in is actually grounded in research. So thinking about the conversation around acceleration versus remediation, and social emotional supports being central to a child's ability to learn. Right? I mean, just recognizing that we have this wealth and decades of research, let's use it. And I know, I threw in a link into the chat box from FutureEd at Georgetown. I know they've done a analysis of state plans and are they investing in evidence-based approaches to closing achievement gaps. So that's something that's top of mind for our members. I think also, I spoke earlier about the strategic plan that many states have. In those strategic plans, they do have goals, right? We are in a new time. We are, in a pandemic and coming out of a pandemic, and some states are considering, okay, well, what does this mean for the goals that we had? Do they need to be refined? Perhaps, but we have these goals. So let's see what can we've all come together and built a consensus around these previously, and engaged in very robust stakeholder engagement processes to come together to have this plan. Now we have the funding, let's work towards achieving it, right? And I think also thinking in line with metrics is come 2020, 2024, 2025, how will we know that we've been successful? What evidence do we want to know that we've collected to determine whether or not the funding had and the funding invested in the specific strategies paid off for what we were hoping it would? And that would help make the case in instances where you had a great success, would help you make the case at the state level to your federal colleagues, and for the district level to your state colleagues, around investing further in those strategies that did work. We all like to invest in successful approaches. So let's go ahead and make sure we're being thoughtful about building that evidence base. So when the time comes, which we all know it will, we already are armed with the information to make smart decisions then as well.
I also just want to add one more thing, just because Megan, you hit on it. I think some of the legislation we're seeing too is really focusing on using phrases in it itself that's high quality or research-based or evidence-based, that's in there, that's in the planning of some of these program developments and some of this. So like you said, we have the tools now. How can state legislators use them, right? So making sure that that's in the layout of some of the legislation that we've seen come up around these topics.
Yeah, thank you. You're making my heart sing, because I think, Catherine, you were the first person to set it, that this is about thinking about systems change. It isn't about investing just in one-off programs, or really thinking about how this money can be used to change the systems that surround children. And I really, really love that. There was a question in the, I'll try to get a question that's in the chat here. One of the questions came from Bethany, and she talked about the issue of using summer for accelerating learning. We had summer of 2020, where I think people thought kids would be back in school, and then they weren't. And then we had this past summer where kids now tend to be back in school. But I'm wondering, between those two summers, if there's anything that's been learned or that you've seen states take, what that's been and actually use that to make investments with the ARPA funding and whatnot. And I see Catherine shaking her head, but I know Autumn, you also have been, like I said, so involved in thinking about the summer learning piece and how states have been supporting that. So anything you want to share on that front?
Catherine, do you want to share something first and then I can share?
Sure. Happy to. Yeah, I think, something that we've really seen is, again, just that general shift in thinking from the need to recover, address the unfinished learning and fill all of these gaps. And, summer learning slide and learning loss and everything has always been a part of that conversation. But we really did see a shift this past summer to addressing those holistic needs and making sure that students felt that they had that trusting adult relationship, had a safe place to go, had all of their needs met, and then were set up for success to do some of that academic recovery, potentially over the summer to prepare for this fall and be ready to start the school year strong. So that's definitely something that we see. And I think as folks are now already planning for next year, we're trying to highlight particular program success stories and elevate some models so that, when we have a little bit more lead time to plan to use this funding, it will really be invested in what we were talking about here, all of these evidence-based programs and things that we know really work well. But we saw states investing in, home visits and making sure that students were being captured back if they were absent in the past school year for a number of reasons, to really, make a strong effort in getting those attendance numbers back up and re-engaging students and families and hearing from them about why they may have been absent and trying to address those needs. So that's certainly something we saw this past summer that I think will unfortunately probably need to be carried into next summer. But again, just focus on looking at what worked and make sure that we're planning intelligently for using these funds.
Yeah, and I'll ditto, what Catherine has said and talk about how, like we said, some of the focus that's shifted from summer just being focused on some of the academic recovery and, being aware that just in this school year alone already, we've seen some of those shift to focusing on their well-being. And I think some of the legislation has, popped back up that we are focusing on, expanding programs so more kids have access and making sure that their needs are being met during those programs through that legislation. We've seen some of the shifts of that already and some of the, what's been looked at or what we've seen from our members. So I'll add, we did a summer legis brief that we do that talks about the policies and the promise of summer enrichment. And so I'll put that in the chat so that we can get to another question, but talks about some of this.
I'll just hop in as we've all been talking about the longevity of these investments and sort of structural changes and ways that we can rethink education. I think there's great opportunity, of course, we are all aware of it, of the teacher preparation and supporting our in-service teachers. And I'm particularly excited about LPI's teacher licensure collaborative, because I think that's a great opportunity, especially for state boards, to leverage their authority around teacher licensure and preparation requirements to empower educators who are entering the classroom with the information they need to be successful, and also supporting educators who are in the classroom and helping them get that in-service continued professional development, also recognize their contribution and their sacrifice and their expertise in this very challenging time, and lifting them up in a profession. And so I think there's great opportunity there as we look for the sort of the long-term change that we're all hoping will happen.
Thanks, Megan. And you said that beautifully. You all did. So thank you. And I wanted to also say thank you for bringing up the educator piece of this too. We've talked so much about supporting the well-being of young people, which we know is so important. And there's already some initial data about how the re-engagement of students is not going particularly well in a lot of places right now because schools are not attending to those needs. But I want to say, in terms of educators, we also know that there has been a lot of educators who have chosen to leave the profession for various reasons. And we know that that was happening before the pandemic, but since. And I think it's really important what you said, Megan, about finding ways to empower educators at this time that otherwise is extremely challenging, and also thinking about their well-being as well. I have one other question from Rita, and some of you might have answered this already, and I know we're running close on time. So if you have a quick answer to any states that are identifying innovative real-time solutions to tackling these challenges. I know we've talked about, like, Autumn, the states that have been looking in the past, and then also trying to think about how to start monitoring. And I know there was another question earlier about have states, when putting in their plans, data, ways to track the data around their investment. So just as we close up, anything to add on that front, that those kind of two different ways of our states actually looking at tackling things in real time, using this funding, using this time and opportunity, and also moving forward, are they going to be thinking about data in real time to address any other improvements or what they've invested in already?
I'll hop in quickly because my answer will be quick. They're asking those questions in real time right now. Those are the questions that we are hearing from our members. So hopefully soon you'll hear answers too, but that's something that they're also grappling with.
I was going to say they're just as in real time of this pandemic as the rest of us are. So I think, trying to figure out how quickly they can get their answers on the table for all of us.
Well, I wish we could give them all a crystal ball to help them see in the future where their investments would go. But it's nice to know that they are asking these questions, that there's such a concern from all of the members that you work with. And I so appreciate you guys taking the time today. This has been such a great discussion to learn about what states are doing across the board in terms of funding and advancing whole child policy at this time that we know that is so important. So thank you all, and I'm gonna turn it back over to Sam. And thank you to the SOLD Alliance for having us today and allowing us to share.
Yeah, such a rich discussion. Thank you all. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Autumn. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Jen, for engaging our community in such an important discussion. Quick note, our next strategy session will be held next month, Tuesday, November 9th at 4:30. So we'll see you back again here. Please mark your calendars. And to stay tuned on any SOLD Alliance events, you can visit our website at soldalliance.org or follow us on Twitter. We need new followers. Please follow us on Twitter at SOLD Alliance. Again, thank you to our Whole Child Policy Table partners, and we hope you all have a great evening. Thank you.